He was the kind of man who carried authority in his stride. Every whistle he blew was law. Every word he spoke echoed with confidence. For 2 decades, Coach Daniel Reeves had been the pride of Briarwood High, the man who turned average teenagers into state champions. Parents adored him. Local reporters called him the miracle worker. The gym bore his name in gold letters, and every season felt like a victory parade waiting to happen. But behind the victories, behind the cheers and trophies, something darker was unfolding. A secret that would shatter not only his career, but an entire community's faith in the very idea of mentorship. It started, as it often does, with small whispers. A few parents noticed their children acting withdrawn after practice. One student stopped showing up altogether. Reeves brushed it off. "Teenagers have moods," he said. The administration agreed. After all, how could the man who brought Briarwood 3 state titles possibly be anything but a role model? The school protected its golden sun, and the whispers faded for a while. The first undeniable crack appeared when one of his star players, 17-year-old Alex Turner, quit mid-season. No explanation, no farewell, just silence. Reeves called it emotional burnout. But Alex's parents later noticed bruises on his upper arms, marks that looked like someone's grip. He refused to talk about it. He deleted all his messages, wiped his phone clean, and began avoiding eye contact with anyone who mentioned the coach. It wasn't until months later, when another player broke down in the locker room, that the real story began to surface. The second boy, Jordan Michaels, confessed through tears that Coach Reeves had been manipulating and controlling players for years, using intimidation, humiliation, and sometimes worse. He described late-night training sessions at the coach's home, where he claimed Reeves crossed every imaginable boundary under the guise of building discipline. The boy's voice shook as he told investigators about the fear that kept them all silent, the fear of losing their scholarships, their reputations, their futures. Reeves, they said, was untouchable. When detectives arrived at Briarwood High, the faculty reacted with disbelief. The athletic director called it an outrageous attack on a beloved educator. The school board launched its own internal review, which quickly turned defensive. But police moved faster. They seized computers, personal devices, and surveillance footage from the gym. What they found confirmed that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern of abuse that stretched back over 10 years. Messages, photos, and journal entries from multiple students painted a haunting picture of a man who built his empire on silence and fear. As the case broke into the media, the town of Briarwood split in two. Half the community still defended the coach, insisting the accusations were lies from bitter teenagers. The other half stood behind the victims, calling for accountability. In one surreal scene, parents protested outside the courthouse, some holding "Justice for Our Kids" signs, while others shouted, "Free Coach Reeves." Reporters swarmed the small town. The once proud gym became a crime scene, yellow tape stretching across the doors that had once opened to cheering crowds. In court, Reeves appeared calm, too calm. Dressed in a suit, hands clasped, he denied everything. His defense painted him as a strict but misunderstood mentor, claiming the boys had fabricated stories for attention. But prosecutors had evidence that went far beyond testimony. A folder recovered from his home computer contained detailed notes about players, not just their performance stats, but their weaknesses, fears, and personal details no coach should ever have known. The jury listened in silence as messages were read aloud, the words cold and calculated, revealing a man who thrived on control. The verdict came after 2 weeks of testimony. Guilty on multiple counts of assault, coercion, and abuse of authority. When the judge read the sentence, 37 years in prison, Reeves finally broke his composure. He whispered something no one could quite hear, then was led away. Outside, parents hugged their children. Reporters spoke into cameras, saying the same words over and over. Briarwood's fallen hero. But for the boys who lived through it, there was no closure. Alex Turner, now 22, later told a journalist that every time he heard a whistle, he still froze. Jordan dropped out of college after struggling with anxiety. The community rebuilt the gym, but they removed Reeves's name, leaving a blank space where the gold letters once shined. Years later, people in Briarwood still avoid saying his name out loud. When the new generation of players practices in that same gym, their footsteps echo off the polished floor, the same place where their parents once cheered, unaware of what was happening just behind those walls. In the end, the question that lingered was the same one whispered in so many homes across America. How did no one see it? How could someone so admired, so celebrated, commit such harm in plain sight? The banners still hang, the trophies still gleam, but to those who know the truth, every victory feels haunted. The line between mentor and monster was always thinner than anyone realized, and when it broke an entire town's faith in the people they trusted most. He was known as Coach T, a name that once commanded respect across the state. Thomas Grady had the kind of charm that won over everyone, athletes, parents, even local politicians. He built his reputation as the head football coach of Eastbrook University, turning a struggling Division II program into a nationally recognized powerhouse. Recruits lined up to play for him. The media called him the architect of dreams. But no one saw how carefully he built those dreams. Not on skill, not on teamwork, but on manipulation, cruelty, and control. At first, the players joked about his methods. The 4 a.m. runs in freezing rain, the drills that lasted until someone collapsed. He's building champions, they said. Grady called it mental warfare, a system to weed out weakness. But behind closed doors, it was something else entirely. Players who questioned him were benched. Those who defied him were humiliated in front of their teammates. One lineman remembered being forced to stand shirtless in the cold while the coach screamed insults for 20 minutes straight. Another described how Grady made them replay footage of their mistakes, pausing to mock their expressions as faces of failure. No one complained. You didn't question Coach T, not if you wanted to stay on the team. The scholarships, the endorsements, the scouts, they all went through him. And he knew it. The breaking point came during the 2018 season. It was late October, a high-stakes game against their biggest rival. In the fourth quarter, defensive captain Eric Lawson took a hit that left him dazed. The team medic said he should sit out. But Grady grabbed his helmet, shoved it back onto his head, and told him to man up. Eric stumbled back onto the field. 2 plays later, he collapsed, motionless. The stadium went silent. Paramedics rushed in, cameras zooming in on a scene that didn't look like football anymore. Eric was rushed to the hospital with a severe concussion and internal bleeding. For 2 days, he hovered between life and death. When the press asked Grady what happened, he brushed it off. He just got shaken up. These kids are tougher than they look. But Eric's family wasn't silent. His parents went public, accusing the coach of endangering their son for the sake of a win. At first, the university tried to contain it. They issued vague statements about safety protocols and ongoing evaluations. But when other players began coming forward, anonymously at first, the pattern was impossible to ignore. One after another, they described a coach who belittled injuries, forced them to play through pain, and punished anyone who showed emotion. A former assistant coach finally broke the silence. He revealed that Grady kept injury reports off the books, marking them as mental weakness. When investigators obtained internal emails, they found proof that the athletic department had ignored warnings for years. Even more disturbing were text messages recovered from Grady's phone, where he mocked players who got concussions as crybabies and fragile. When the NCAA investigation began, Grady vanished. He didn't show up for practice, didn't return calls, didn't even clean out his office. For 3 weeks, no one knew where he was, until a reporter found him living at a relative's lake house 2 states away. Cameras captured the moment he was served his suspension notice. His once confident posture looked broken, but he still insisted he'd done nothing wrong. "This is football," he said, "not ballet." The trial that followed wasn't about a single injury. It was about a culture of cruelty. Former players testified about exhaustion, verbal degradation, and dangerous drills that left permanent damage. One described being locked in the weight room for hours as punishment for missing curfew. Another revealed he'd been told to hide his limp during a televised game, fearing he'd lose his spot if he appeared weak. By the time the verdict came, public opinion had turned. Sponsors withdrew. Alumni demanded accountability. Grady was banned from coaching at any collegiate level, stripped of his accolades, and found guilty of reckless endangerment and misconduct. Eric survived, but he never played again. The injury left him with recurring seizures and memory loss. His parents sued the university, winning a settlement that couldn't undo what had been lost. During interviews, Eric often pauses mid-sentence, trying to recall a word he once knew. "I used to dream about football," he said once, staring at the field where he fell. Now I just dream about walking away from it. The stadium lights at Eastbrook still shine every Friday night, but they shine on a new era, one where players glance nervously at the sidelines, where parents watch every tackle with fear. The university has rebuilt its image, but the stain of what happened lingers like an echo in every locker room. The question that remains is one too many institutions refuse to face. When does toughness become abuse? Grady claimed he was preparing them for the real world, but in the end, he broke them to prove his power. His legacy isn't in trophies or titles. It's in the silence that follows every whistle blown by a coach who learned the wrong lesson from his fall. They said she was the best thing that ever happened to women's gymnastics. Coach Marissa Caldwell, young, magnetic, fierce in her pursuit of perfection. Her athletes called her Coach Cal, a name that rolled off the tongue with a mix of admiration and fear. She ran the Caldwell Academy, a prestigious private training center where dreams of Olympic gold were forged. Parents flew their daughters from across the country to train under her. She promised discipline, precision, victory. And for years, she delivered all three, until the truth about her methods turned that dream into a nightmare. The academy was spotless. White walls, polished floors, the faint smell of chalk and sweat. Every corner held trophies, medals, photographs of smiling girls in glittering leotards. But beneath the surface, something cruel pulsed through the air. Caldwell preached control. Every calorie was counted, every word monitored. Girls as young as 12 were weighed daily, sometimes twice a day. "Pain is weakness leaving the body," she'd whisper to crying athletes. "You want to win? Then stop being human." At first, parents saw only results. Podium finishes, scholarships, scouts taking notes in the bleachers. They called her tough but brilliant. The girls, meanwhile, learned to keep their pain silent. They taped their own injuries, lied about dizziness, and smiled through exhaustion. One of them, 16-year-old Rachel Holt, was Caldwell's favorite. She'd won nationals 2 years in a row and was considered an Olympic hopeful. But in private, Rachel was breaking. During one late-night practice, she fell from the uneven bars and landed awkwardly. Her wrist snapped with an audible crack. The sound silenced the entire gym. Caldwell didn't rush to help. She walked over slowly, stared down at the trembling girl, and said, "You should have listened to my correction." Rachel was taken to the hospital, but Caldwell ordered the other girls to keep practicing. The next morning, she told them Rachel's injury was a lesson in failure. That was the moment something inside the team began to shift. A few athletes started secretly journaling what happened, the punishments, the verbal abuse, the starvation drills. Caldwell made them perform accountability circles, where each girl had to confess her mistakes in front of the group. If someone gained weight, the coach announced it publicly. If someone cried, she mocked them for performing weakness. The first report didn't come from the girls. It came from a new assistant coach named Tara Jensen. She had been hired only 6 months earlier and immediately noticed things that didn't feel right. The girls weren't just tired. They were terrified. Tara later described watching Caldwell slap a beam in anger inches from a gymnast's face. When she reported her concerns to the academy board, they dismissed her. "Marissa's tough," they said. "That's why she wins." But Tara didn't stop. She reached out to the parents. At first, few believed her. Then one day she received an anonymous email from a former gymnast. The message was short. "Everything she says about Coach Cal is true. She ruined me." Attached was a photo of the girl, skeletal, hollow-eyed, her spine visible through her shirt. She had been hospitalized for an eating disorder at 14. That photo and the testimony that followed broke the story open. When investigators arrived, they uncovered a hidden world of control disguised as coaching. Hundreds of text messages revealed Caldwell tracking her athletes' meals, sleep patterns, even menstrual cycles. Surveillance footage showed her screaming inches from girls' faces, calling them fat, lazy, and unworthy. Dozens of gymnasts, current and former, came forward with similar stories. Some spoke about anxiety and depression that lingered long after leaving the academy. One said she hadn't looked in a mirror for years without hearing Caldwell's voice in her head. The scandal consumed the sport. News anchors debated the line between discipline and abuse. Parents who once idolized Caldwell now appeared on camera, tearfully apologizing for not listening to their daughters sooner. The academy shut down within weeks, its glossy walls left empty, the sound of chalk dust settling like snow over a grave. In court, Caldwell remained unrepentant. She claimed her methods were necessary for greatness. Her defense cited examples of other strict coaches, arguing she was being punished for expecting excellence. But the testimonies told a different story, one of psychological manipulation, of teenage girls pushed beyond their limits for medals that now meant nothing. When the verdict came, guilty on multiple counts of child endangerment and emotional abuse, Caldwell stared straight ahead, expressionless. The sentence? 9 years in prison and a lifetime ban from coaching. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet sobs of former gymnasts seated behind her. Years later, Rachel Holt recovered enough to coach younger gymnasts, but not the way she was taught. Her approach was gentle, empathetic. Winning, she said in one interview, means nothing if you lose yourself getting there. The Caldwell Academy building was eventually repurposed as a youth wellness center. On the day it reopened, a former gymnast left a single pair of chalked handprints on the front wall, a quiet mark of defiance, a reminder that perfection built on fear always cracks. In the end, the legacy of Coach Marissa Caldwell wasn't her medals or her champions. It was the echo of silence that filled every gym where young girls learned that pain was normal, that suffering was strength. That echo still lingers, soft but haunting, like the creak of a balance beam under the weight of a lie finally exposed. He walked with a limp that seemed to make him more intimidating. Coach Robert Bobby Keller had once been a boxer, the kind who took more punches than he gave, and the damage followed him into his next career. At Riverbend Youth Academy, a private boarding school for troubled teens, Keller was the head of athletics and discipline, 2 words that meant the same thing under his rule. He believed in breaking boys down to build men, and the administration, eager for his results, let him do just that. Parents sent their sons there for structure. Keller promised transformation. What they didn't know was how he achieved it. The boys called the gym the pit. Concrete floors, no windows, a constant smell of bleach and sweat. Every morning before sunrise, Keller made them run laps around the campus, no matter the weather. Late? That meant extra drills. Talking back? That meant correction sessions. Closed-door punishments no one dared describe. The staff heard rumors but ignored them. Keller's methods produced results: top test scores, low incident rates, glowing reviews from parents. The boys behaved even if their eyes told another story. It started unraveling when a 15-year-old named Marcus Reed disappeared. He was new, quiet, a kid who kept to himself. One night he didn't show up for evening roll call. Keller told the dorm supervisors he'd run away. No one questioned him until a janitor found Marcus's sneakers behind the gym, spattered with dried blood. Police were called, but Keller remained calm, almost rehearsed. The boy was unstable, he said. We did our best. When investigators combed through the facility, they noticed inconsistencies, missing security footage, altered attendance records. Keller claimed the cameras in the gym had malfunctioned that week. But a hard drive recovered from the school's server told a different story. Hidden folders contained videos of Keller conducting correction sessions, scenes of him forcing boys to fight each other as punishment, shouting that weakness was a disease. In one clip, Marcus could be seen collapsing mid-drill, gasping for air as Keller screamed for him to keep going. The footage stopped abruptly. The next discovery came from a nearby river, 3 miles from the school. A fisherman spotted something caught among the reeds, a jacket, torn and waterlogged, stitched with the initials MR. Divers later recovered Marcus's body not far downstream. The coroner's report listed blunt force trauma and hypothermia. His injuries were consistent with repeated impact and prolonged exposure to the cold. The town erupted. Parents demanded answers, the academy shut its gates, and Keller was arrested on suspicion of manslaughter. Reporters descended on Riverbend, broadcasting images of a place once marketed as a sanctuary, now surrounded by police tape. In interrogation, Keller was defiant. "These boys come here broken," he said. "If they die trying to fix themselves, that's on them." But his facade cracked when investigators presented the videos. His expression changed from arrogance to something colder, calculation. He stopped talking after that. The trial exposed years of abuse hidden behind the academy's polished brochures. Former students testified about sleep deprivation, starvation punishments, and forced sparring matches that left them bleeding. One described being locked in the equipment room overnight. Another said Keller made them kneel on concrete until their knees bled. He called it discipline, one boy said through tears. We called it surviving. The jury took only 2 days to deliberate. Keller was found guilty of second-degree murder, multiple counts of child abuse, and obstruction of justice. When the sentence was read, life in prison, he barely reacted. In the back of the courtroom, Marcus's mother wept quietly, clutching a photo of her son in his school uniform, smiling, alive. After the conviction, the academy shut down permanently. The grounds were left to rot. Weeds overtook the field. The gym windows shattered one by one. Local kids whispered that you could still hear Keller's whistle echoing at dawn, the sound that once sent dozens of frightened boys running into the fog. For the survivors, the memories never really faded. Some refused to talk about it at all. Others formed a support group, meeting once a year in a community center miles away from Riverbend. They talked about guilt, about how silence had become a way of staying safe. One man, now in his 30s, said he still wakes up at 5 a.m. without an alarm, his body remembering the drills. The story of Riverbend became a cautionary tale whispered in youth programs across the country. It asked a question too many institutions ignore. When punishment becomes cruelty, who decides where the line is? For Keller, that line never existed. To him, every bruise was proof of control, every scar a lesson learned. Years later, when a journalist asked one of the surviving boys what he would say to his old coach if he could, the man paused for a long time before answering. I wouldn't say anything, he said softly. I'd just tell him that Marcus learned to run faster than he ever did, right out of his reach. And somewhere in the silence that follows, between the broken bleachers and the ghost of a whistle's echo, the truth of Coach Bobby Keller's legacy remains, not in trophies but in trauma, sealed inside the walls of a place that was supposed to save them. He was the pride of the state's wrestling circuit, a man whose name had become synonymous with victory. Coach Alan Draper had built the Millstone High wrestling team into a dynasty. He called his athletes his boys, a phrase that sounded affectionate until people learned what it really meant. Draper was magnetic, the kind of man who shook every parent's hand and remembered every kid's birthday. He hosted team barbecues, posted motivational quotes on social media, and preached honor through discipline. But underneath that perfect image was a man who saw power as entitlement. And for years, no one dared to question him. Millstone was a small town, the kind where sports weren't just entertainment, they were identity. The wrestling team had put the school on the map, and Draper was its architect. When the trophies started stacking up, no one noticed how late some boys stayed after practice, or how Draper's car was often parked behind the gym long after dark. The parents saw medals and smiles in photos. The boys, though, saw something else when the cameras were gone. It started with special sessions. He'd call them into his office one by one, telling them he saw potential, that he could make them state champions. What happened in those sessions was something most of the boys tried to erase from memory, the kind of violations that leave scars invisible to everyone but those who carry them. The first boy to speak was 19 when he finally told his story. His name was Drew, and he had once been Draper's favorite, the captain, the golden boy. He came forward after a night of drinking, when the guilt and shame cracked open years of silence. He told a friend what happened after practice one night, how he froze when the coach locked the door. His friend urged him to tell the police. The statement he gave began an investigation that would uncover a trail of hidden trauma spanning over a decade. At first, the community resisted. They called Drew a liar, said he wanted attention or revenge. The local paper published a headline defending Draper. Teachers wore pins that said, "Stand with Coach." But then another boy came forward. And another. Each story followed the same pattern. Private meetings, grooming, silence. When police searched Draper's home, they found a locked filing cabinet filled with photographs, videos, and handwritten notes detailing each wrestler's stats, weaknesses, and personal struggles. It was clear he'd studied them like prey. He called it psychological strategy. The investigators called it evidence. The trial was one of the most publicized in the state's history. The courtroom overflowed with reporters, families, and former students. Draper sat stone-faced, flanked by his lawyers, while his former wrestlers, now men in their 20s and 30s, testified about the manipulation, the fear, and the shame. Some couldn't finish their statements without breaking down. One described how Draper told him he'd ruin his scholarship if he ever spoke out. Another said he'd tried to tell his parents once, but they refused to believe him. "He's a good man," they'd said. "You must have misunderstood." The defense tried to paint Draper as a strict but misunderstood mentor, insisting that the accusations were exaggerated, that the evidence was misinterpreted. But the jury didn't buy it, not after the prosecutors played one of the recovered videos, a silent, grainy recording that confirmed what the victims had been too afraid to describe. The sound in the courtroom was suffocating. Even the defense attorneys looked away. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Draper showed no emotion. He was sentenced to 65 years in prison. The judge called his actions an orchestrated campaign of control and exploitation. Outside the courthouse, the once proud Millstone community was eerily quiet. Parents who had once defended him now avoided eye contact with reporters. The banners that once celebrated his victories were torn down that same night. In the years that followed, Millstone struggled to recover. The school renamed the gym, removed every photograph, every plaque, but the stain remained. Former students spoke at conferences about the dangers of hero worship in sports. Drew started an advocacy group for survivors, though he admitted he still has nightmares. "He made us believe he owned us," he said once in an interview. It took years to realize he never did. Every season since, the wrestling team starts with a moment of silence. Not for Draper, but for the ones who never got to speak. The sound of that silence carries more weight than any applause that Jim ever heard. Sometimes, when local news covers a new generation of athletes, they show quick clips of Millstone's bright new coach, a younger man who insists he's doing things differently. He talks about trust, accountability, and safety. But beneath his words, there's always the shadow of the man who came before, a reminder that monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they wear school colors and stand at the center of the mat, smiling for the camera, while no one dares to look behind them. The story of Coach Alan Draper isn't about one predator. It's about a system that rewards silence, that mistakes dominance for leadership. It's about what happens when winning becomes more important than truth. For those boys, the victories were never real. They were masks, trophies held up by trembling hands that had already lost more than anyone could see. And even now, long after the cheers have faded, the mat remains a graveyard of trust. The echoes of their screams, buried beneath the sound of applause, are what Millstone can never erase. He came from nothing, or at least that's what he told everyone. Coach Vincent Harlow liked to remind his players that he'd earned every inch of success. He'd grown up in a rough neighborhood, worked his way through community college, and built one of the most competitive basketball programs in the region. To the outside world, he was a story of grit, a man who turned troubled teens into disciplined athletes. Reporters loved his swagger, his motivational speeches, his slogans about loyalty and family. Family was his favorite word. He said it every time he pulled the team together in the locker room. But what no one saw was how he used that word to trap them. At Northcrest Academy, Coach Harlow wasn't just a coach. He was a father figure, a guardian, a gatekeeper. The boys came from broken homes, foster care, poverty, kids who needed someone to believe in them. And Harlow knew exactly how to make them believe. He bought them shoes, drove them to school, gave them places to stay when home wasn't safe. It started with kindness. It always does. But somewhere between practice and promises, that kindness turned into control. He isolated them one by one, told them their families didn't care about them, that he was the only one who truly understood. He told them that loyalty meant keeping secrets, that real family didn't betray trust. The first red flag came from a former player who had graduated years earlier. He'd left the team abruptly, vanished from the school's social media, and no one ever said why. Years later, he reached out to a local journalist and said just 6 words, "Coach Harlow isn't who you think." The journalist started digging. It began with simple questions. How many players had left suddenly? Why some transcripts were missing? Why certain parents weren't allowed to attend practices? The deeper she went, the darker it got. Several former players admitted they'd been forced to perform personal errands for the coach, even late at night. One said he was made to live in Harlow's basement for a year after being told he'd be kicked off the team otherwise. Others described psychological manipulation, being shamed in front of teammates, being told they'd never make it without him. When the first lawsuit hit the school, the community split. Some defended him fiercely, calling the allegations a smear campaign. Others, especially those who had lost sons to his program's relentless pressure, quietly supported the investigation. Police searched Harlow's home and found dozens of personal items belonging to his players, watches, letters, even family photos. When asked why he had them, he said they were mementos. Then came the most damning evidence: surveillance footage from the school gym, hidden behind the scoreboard. The recording showed Harlow berating players, throwing objects, grabbing them by the neck during practice. It wasn't the kind of tough love he bragged about. It was cruelty captured in high definition. The footage went viral overnight. National outlets picked up the story. "The family that broke itself," one headline read. Sponsors withdrew. Former players who had stayed silent for years finally stepped forward. One of them, 25-year-old Chris Daniels, broke down during an interview. "He made me think I owed him my life," he said. "When I realized I didn't know who I was anymore." The trial that followed exposed Harlow's empire for what it really was: a network built on exploitation and emotional manipulation. Prosecutors described him as a man who weaponized care. Every act of generosity came with a hook. The defense tried to argue that he'd gone too far in pursuit of excellence, but the jury saw through it. The emotional testimonies from his former players were impossible to ignore. When the verdict came, Harlow stared blankly at the judge. Guilty on multiple counts of assault, coercion, and misconduct. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. His attorney tried to appeal, citing mental health struggles, but the damage was done. The man once hailed as a savior of troubled youth was now just another name in a long list of fallen idols. After his conviction, North Crest Academy shut down its athletic department for 2 years. The gym stayed empty, the floor covered in dust. When it finally reopened, the first practice began not with a whistle, but with silence. The new coach asking the boys to take a moment to remember why they played. Not for trophies, not for fear, but for the love of the game itself. For many of Harlow's former players, that love never returned. Chris Daniels now works as a social worker, helping teens from backgrounds like his own. He avoids gyms. The sound of squeaking sneakers and bouncing basketballs makes his stomach twist. "I used to think family meant loyalty," he said once. "Now I think it just means freedom." In the end, Coach Vincent Harlow's story became a lesson too late learned, that predators don't always hide behind closed doors. Sometimes they stand in front of cheering crowds, their sins camouflaged by success. The word family, once painted in bold letters across the locker room wall, has since been scrubbed away. But those who played under him say they can still see the outline, faint, ghost-like, whenever the lights hit the wall just right. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. Coach Evelyn Marks was the kind of woman sports movies are made about. Fierce, sharp, and endlessly ambitious. She coached the women's gymnastics team at Brookhaven University, a Midwestern school that suddenly started winning national titles the moment she arrived. She was called the Iron Spine for her discipline, her eye for perfection, her refusal to accept mediocrity. For nearly a decade, she was celebrated as a pioneer, a woman who fought her way through a male-dominated world and built champions out of ordinary college girls. But behind the medals, the slogans, and the glossy university brochures was a story that would make even her most devoted athletes question every lesson she'd ever taught them. Her team loved her, or at least they thought they did. She was intense but charismatic, always calling her gymnasts "my girls," always reminding them they were a family bound by greatness. That phrase was painted in silver letters on the gym wall. Her girls wrote it on their water bottles and stitched it into their warm-up jackets. But under the weight of that mantra, something poisonous grew. Evelyn Marks had rules, strict, invasive, unrelenting. Weigh-ins twice a day, journals to track every calorie, daily loyalty meetings where athletes were required to share personal confessions to purify their focus. If anyone refused, she benched them indefinitely. She'd humiliate them publicly, call them selfish, accuse them of letting the team down. To outsiders, it looked like discipline. To those inside, it felt like captivity. Things escalated after Brookhaven's third consecutive national championship. With fame came attention, and with attention came pressure. Marks began selecting a few gymnasts for special training sessions after hours. No assistants, no witnesses. The girls who went in came out shaken, trembling, sometimes in tears, but they said nothing. Their scholarships, their dreams, their futures depended on her. It wasn't until a freshman named Lila Hayes collapsed during practice that someone finally spoke. She'd been fainting frequently, her body starving under the weight of Marks's diet regimen. At the hospital, when the nurse asked if she'd eaten that day, Lila whispered, "Coach says hunger sharpens the mind." That single line cracked the illusion. An anonymous email was sent to the university board. a long, detailed report describing psychological abuse, forced fasting, isolation, and verbal degradation. Within a week, the university opened an internal investigation, but Marks still coached every day as if nothing had changed. When reporters started asking questions, she called it a smear campaign by lazy athletes. Her team, terrified of losing scholarships, defended her publicly. But behind closed doors, cracks widened. One gymnast, senior captain Rachel Quinn, couldn't take it anymore. She leaked photos of bruises on her arms, sent from Marks's correction drills. The evidence spread fast. News outlets ran the story nonstop. Champion coach accused of cruelty. Former athletes from her early years came forward with eerily similar accounts, psychological torment disguised as mentorship. Police searched her office and found dozens of confiscated journals, each belonging to one of her gymnasts. Inside were pages of personal confessions, insecurities, and fears, annotated by Marks in red ink. In the margins, she'd written things like weak, selfish, replaceable. They weren't motivational notes. They were control mechanisms. When the trial began, Marks walked into the courtroom dressed in her old team colors, her hair tied back like she was heading to a meet. She smiled as her former gymnasts took the stand, one after another, trembling as they described years of manipulation. "She taught us to hate ourselves," Rachel said through tears. She called it coaching. Marks showed no remorse. She argued that every champion needs to be broken before they can be rebuilt. "They wanted to win," she told the jury, "and I gave them what they wanted." The prosecution countered with testimony from psychologists and athletic experts who called her methods ritualized abuse. In the end, she was found guilty of multiple counts of harassment, coercion, and endangerment. Her sentence was 10 years in federal prison with no eligibility for early release. Brookhaven University issued a public apology, disbanded the gymnastics program for 2 seasons, and removed her banners from the gym. But the emotional scars remained. Lila Hayes never competed again. Rachel Quinn left gymnastics entirely and became an advocate for athlete protection laws. Years later, during a televised interview, she was asked if she ever forgave her former coach. She paused, her eyes wet. "I don't think about forgiveness," she said softly. "I think about freedom. Because for years we thought she was the reason we could fly. We didn't realize she was the one cutting our wings." Today, the old gym where Evelyn Marks built her empire stands silent, its walls freshly painted. The silver slogan, "Family Bound by Greatness," has been replaced by a new one. "We rise together, we break no one." But the echoes of her voice still linger in that space. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light feels like a ghost whispering the same chilling truth, that sometimes the greatest evil hides not in anger or hatred, but in the obsession to be perfect. Coach Darren Cole was the kind of man small towns built statues for. He'd spent 25 years running the Redfield High football program, a local hero who turned a struggling team into state champions. Parents trusted him. Reporters adored him. The town called him Coach D. On Friday nights, when the floodlights hit the field and the bleachers filled with cheering families, he stood at the center of it all, arms crossed, whistle around his neck, looking like the embodiment of discipline and pride. He was the kind of man you'd never suspect. The kind of man who'd make you doubt your own instincts, even when something felt wrong. For years, whispers surrounded Coach Cole, but they always died quickly. A player suddenly transferring mid-season. A parent pulling their kid from the team without explanation. Each time, the town rallied around him. "People just can't handle his standards," they said. "He's old school." But the truth was far darker than anyone wanted to believe. It started with a group of boys who called themselves the Circle. They were the team's seniors, handpicked by Cole for what he called leadership training. He told them they were learning what it took to be real men. The sessions were held after dark, in the field house, long after everyone else had gone home. What happened inside those walls stayed there. No one dared talk about it, until one of the boys, 17-year-old Jacob Mills, couldn't take it anymore. Jacob was found wandering outside a gas station 2 towns over, barefoot and shaking. When police brought him in, he refused to speak at first. When he finally did, his words sent shockwaves through Redfield. He told investigators about the rituals, forced physical punishments that bordered on torture, degrading initiation tasks, psychological manipulation disguised as discipline. He said Coach Cole told them pain was proof of loyalty. The sheriff's office launched a quiet investigation, unsure how to handle the fallout. In a town where everyone knew everyone, accusing Coach Cole was like accusing God himself. But evidence piled up. Text messages, photos, bruises. Other players came forward anonymously, describing the same late-night trainings, the same emotional breakdowns. Each story was consistent, detailed, and hauntingly believable. When the first arrest warrant was issued, the town split in two. Some residents stood outside the courthouse chanting his name, claiming he was being framed by weak kids. Others couldn't meet each other's eyes, suddenly questioning every memory of those Friday night games. The school district suspended him, but he refused to resign. "Everything I did," he told a local reporter, "was to make boys into men. If that's a crime now, so be it." The trial became national news. The courtroom was packed. Alumni, parents, media. The prosecution laid out years of evidence. Videos from the locker room, written notes in Cole's handwriting that said things like "pain cleans the soul" and "fear builds warriors." Several players took the stand, describing how Cole broke them down mentally until they couldn't distinguish love from punishment. Jacob Mills testified last. He sat trembling, eyes red, and said quietly, "We thought he was saving us. But he was just seeing how far he could go before we stopped him." The defense tried to argue that Cole's methods were traditional, that he never meant harm. They called it tough coaching. But the jury saw the truth. It wasn't about discipline. It was about control. In the end, he was convicted on multiple counts of abuse, coercion, and battery. The sentence, 30 years without parole. The night of his sentencing, Redfield's stadium lights stayed off for the first time in decades. The field was empty, silent except for the wind brushing through the goalposts. The town that had once worshipped him now spoke of him in whispers, as if saying his name might bring something back. Jacob left Redfield not long after. He moved to another state, changed schools, never played football again. Years later, during an interview for a documentary, he said, "Every Friday night I still hear the crowd. I still smell the grass. But when I see those lights in my head, I don't see the game. I see the field house. I see him." Coach Cole's legacy was erased, the banners taken down, the trophies boxed away. The statue the town had planned to build never materialized. But even now, decades later, you can still find people in Redfield who flinch when they hear a whistle blow. To them, it isn't just a sound that starts a game. It's the sound of obedience, the echo of a man who convinced a whole town that cruelty was strength. Coach Melissa Grant was the picture of composure. Tall, calm, always smiling. She ran the elite youth swimming program at Blue Water Aquatics, a place where parents paid thousands hoping their children might one day stand on an Olympic podium. She'd been a competitive swimmer herself, a local prodigy whose career ended too soon after an injury. When she started coaching, people said she had found her calling. She spoke softly, inspired fiercely, and had an almost magnetic charm. For over a decade, her swimmers brought home gold medals and national rankings. Parents called her a mentor, a second mother. But no one saw what happened once the pool lights went out. It began with what seemed like dedication. Coach Grant ran extra practices before dawn, and the most ambitious swimmers loved the attention. She told them she was giving them a champion's edge. But soon the edge became exhaustion. She wouldn't let them eat until after certain lap counts. She made them swim until their muscles gave out, and if they complained, she'd smile and say, "Champions don't cry, they conquer." Her praise was intoxicating. The better they performed, the more she rewarded them with her approval. It was control disguised as care. Things took a darker turn when a new assistant coach, Ryan Ward, joined the program. Within weeks, he began noticing things that didn't add up. Melissa would dismiss parents from the facility early, saying she preferred distraction-free focus. She had swimmers fill out mindset logs that asked questions far too personal, about their fears, family, even private relationships. When Ryan confronted her, she brushed him off. "You're new here," she said. "You don't understand what it takes to win." Then one night, Ryan stayed late to finish paperwork. As he walked past the pool office, he overheard Melissa talking to one of her top swimmers, 16-year-old Tara. Her tone was calm, but her words made his stomach drop. "You know what happens if you let me down again," she said. Tara's voice was trembling. "I'll do better, coach." He waited until Melissa left, then found Tara sitting alone, crying quietly. She didn't say much, only that she was scared to go home because coach might tell my parents I'm weak. Ryan went to the board. The next day he was fired for disrupting the chain of command. But he didn't stop there. He went to the local paper, anonymously at first, detailing everything he'd witnessed. The story broke like wildfire. Reporters flooded Blue Water, demanding answers. Melissa denied everything, calling it an attack on successful women in sports. The parents divided immediately. Some refused to believe she could be abusive. Others started remembering small moments that suddenly seemed sinister. Their kids avoiding eye contact, dreading practice, crying in cars before meets. When police searched her office, they found a locked filing cabinet filled with videotapes. Every tape had a name and a date. Hundreds of hours of footage, training reviews, she called them, but many captured moments of emotional breakdowns, forced punishments, humiliation sessions she'd labeled mental conditioning. Investigators also found dozens of personal letters from swimmers who had left the program, some begging her to stop contacting them. The trial was harrowing. Her former swimmers, now adults, testified one by one. They described how she used fear to control them, how she convinced them that pain meant progress. Tara took the stand last. Her voice cracked as she said, "She told us that if we didn't bleed for her, we didn't deserve to swim." The prosecution called her methods psychological torture, arguing that she had built a cult under the guise of a sports program. Melissa showed no emotion as she listened, no tears, no apologies. In her final statement, she said, "They begged me to make them great. I simply did." The jury took less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: coercion, harassment, endangerment. Her sentence, 25 years without parole. The judge called her a predator cloaked in mentorship. Blue Water Aquatics shut down within months. The pool was drained, the walls stripped bare. The lane numbers faded, the chlorine smell gone. Years later, the facility reopened under a new name with one rule written above the entrance: the water heals, it never hurts. Tara never returned to swimming. She became a writer, publishing a memoir called Beneath the Surface. In one passage, she wrote, "When you spend years learning that love feels like drowning, even calm water can terrify you. Coach Melissa Grant still insists she's misunderstood. She gives interviews from prison saying she was destroyed by softness. But the truth, as her victims know too well, is that her kind of strength was nothing more than cruelty polished to shine like gold. And even now, when the new swimmers dive into that same pool, locals swear the water feels colder than it should, as if it remembers what happened there." Coach Peter Lang was a legend in every sense of the word. He'd coached at Eastborough University for over 3 decades, building one of the most respected track and field programs in the country. To anyone outside the campus, he was a hero, the kind of man who gave speeches about perseverance and integrity, the kind of coach who stayed late to help students train long after the stadium lights went out. His office walls were lined with trophies, medals, photos with Olympic athletes he'd mentored. They called him Coach Gold, both for the medals his athletes won and for the way he seemed untouchable, like a monument carved from success itself. But beneath that gleaming reputation, there was rot. The kind that hides in plain sight for years, shielded by applause and loyalty. It began with whispers in the locker room, stories of secret training sessions, emotional outbursts, impossible demands. Most players ignored them. After all, Peter Lang produced champions, and champions didn't complain. But everything changed when 21-year-old sprinter Naomi Bell collapsed during practice one spring morning. At first, it seemed like heat stroke, but the paramedics found something strange. Her body weight was dangerously low, and her blood tests showed signs of severe malnutrition. When the hospital contacted her parents, they were shocked. Naomi had been living on a strict nutrition plan designed by Coach Lang himself. When questioned, Lang dismissed it as discipline for elite athletes. But then other runners started coming forward. One of them, a sophomore named Clara, told investigators that Lang made them submit daily body check photos, forcing them to stand on a scale while he took notes. If their weight changed by more than a pound, they'd be benched or forced to run punishment laps until they vomited. It might have ended there, just another scandal fading into the background, if not for a discovery that changed everything. Naomi's roommate, while clearing out her dorm, found a small notebook hidden behind the radiator. Inside were pages of notes, detailed, dated records of meetings with Lang. He'd written down every emotional breakdown, every tear, every confession the girls had made during private mentorship sessions. Some pages were underlined, annotated with cruel remarks. One line read, "Fear makes the legs lighter." Another control equals gold. The notebook was turned over to authorities. What followed was a full-scale investigation by both the university and law enforcement. Dozens of former athletes came forward, describing how Lang's program was more like a cult. He isolated them from family, demanded complete obedience, and punished emotional weakness. He convinced them that he was their only path to greatness. For years, no one questioned it because the results were undeniable. National titles, world records, Olympic qualifiers. But behind each victory was a broken athlete. When Lang was arrested, he looked almost relieved. The press surrounded him as he was escorted from his home, his face expressionless. "You can't build champions without sacrifice," he said. They just never understood the price. The trial was long and painful. The prosecution laid out a timeline stretching back nearly 20 years. Manipulation, mental abuse, starvation tactics, and coercion. Former athletes testified through tears. One said she still had nightmares of him whispering, "You don't need food, you need focus." Another recalled him burning a medal in front of her, saying she didn't deserve it after missing a practice to attend her mother's funeral. Lang's defense claimed it was intense coaching, not cruelty. But the evidence, the journals, the emails, the testimonies, told a different story. He wasn't shaping athletes. He was breaking them. In the courtroom, Naomi Bell's parents sat quietly through every session, holding the medal their daughter had won before she collapsed. She never returned to the track. Her career ended that day. Her voice would be the last one heard in court, a pre-recorded statement she'd made for the investigation. In it, she said softly, "He made me hate running, and running used to be my freedom." When the verdict came, Peter Lang was found guilty on multiple counts of abuse, coercion, and endangerment. The judge called his program an empire of fear. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison. The university stripped his name from every building and revoked his awards. The banners came down. The stadium lights dimmed for one night in remembrance of the athletes whose dreams had been crushed in his pursuit of perfection. Years later, Clara returned to that same track. She stood at the starting line, the stands empty, the silence heavy. She closed her eyes and listened. No whistle, no shouting, no commands. Just the wind. "This is what it should have felt like," she whispered. The legend of Coach Peter Lang is still told at Eastboro, but not as inspiration, as a warning. The story of how a man who preached excellence lost his soul chasing it, and how the echo of his whistle still haunts the track where he built his throne. Because in the end, greatness earned through fear isn't greatness at all. It's just cruelty dressed in gold. Coach Daniel Reeves was the kind of man who could make a team believe anything was possible. He coached the varsity baseball team at Brenton High, a small-town program that had never won a state title until he arrived. Within 5 years, they were unstoppable. Parents said he was a genius. Players said he was a god. He'd show up at 5 a.m. with a coffee in one hand and a bat in the other, shouting, "Discipline builds destiny." His energy was infectious, his drive relentless. To the school, he was a savior. But what no one saw was how easily a savior can become a tyrant. It started with the little things. Extra practices that ran late, punishments for missed catches, speeches that blurred the line between motivation and manipulation. "If you want to be family," he'd say, "you have to suffer together." It sounded noble, even inspiring, until suffering became the only thing that held them together. Over time, Ruiz built something darker, a hierarchy of loyalty. The captains were his favorites, chosen not for skill, but for obedience. He'd take them on private trips, reward them with new gear, let them skip drills. In return, they enforced his rules on everyone else. Those who questioned him were humiliated in front of the team. He'd scream until his face turned red, call them weak, make them run until their legs gave out. The boys learned quickly. The only way to survive was silence. Then came the night everything began to unravel. After a big playoff win, Ruiz hosted a team bonding gathering at his house, something he'd done before. Parents trusted him. He was like family to most of them. But this time a storm rolled in. The players stayed late, drinking under his supervision, the coach joining in. At some point, one of the younger players, 16-year-old Eric Nolan, tried to leave. Ruiz stopped him at the door, furious. "No one leaves my team early," he barked. "Not until I say so." Witnesses said the argument escalated, that Ruiz shoved Eric, who slipped and hit his head on the kitchen counter. Panic set in. The players froze, too scared to move. Ruiz told them it was an accident. "You'll ruin everything if you say a word," he whispered. Eric was found unconscious hours later when another parent came looking for him. He survived, but the truth didn't stay buried for long. His parents demanded answers. The team, terrified, tried to stick to Ruiz's version of events. But guilt ate away at them. One by one, they started talking about the drinking, the punishments, the screaming, the late-night messages from the coach telling them loyalty is everything. When the police opened an investigation, they uncovered more than anyone expected. Ruiz had been manipulating players for years, coercing them into obedience with threats of losing their scholarships or being benched. Texts showed him bragging to assistants about how he broke boys into men. The phrase became central in court, the chilling motto of a man who believed cruelty was a form of guidance. The trial tore the town apart. Half the community refused to believe it. "He's tough, not cruel," one parent told reporters. "He gave these boys discipline." But others, especially those whose sons had come home crying night after night, knew better. They saw the control, the fear, the emotional scars. Ruiz took the stand, defiant and unrepentant. He insisted he'd done nothing wrong, that everything he did was for their own good. But when Eric Nolan, his head still bearing a thin scar, took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. His voice shook as he said, "He made us afraid to lose, afraid to speak, afraid to breathe wrong. That's not coaching. That's control." The jury didn't take long. Coach Daniel Reeves was found guilty of endangerment, coercion, and assault. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He didn't look at his players as he was led away, only muttered under his breath, "You were supposed to be stronger than this." Brenton High disbanded the baseball program for 3 seasons. The field became overgrown, the bleachers rusted. The scoreboard still reads 4-2, the score from their last championship game, the day before it all fell apart. Years later, Eric returned to the field. He stood at home plate, the grass whispering around his ankles, the sun setting behind the empty stands. He dropped a baseball, watched it roll into the dirt, and said quietly, "He taught us to win. But he never taught us how to be free." The story of Coach Daniel Reeves still lingers in Brenton, not as nostalgia, but as a scar. A reminder that the line between discipline and domination is razor thin, and once crossed, it doesn't just destroy a team. It consumes every soul that trusted the person holding the whistle. Coach Marissa Drayton had been the pride of her college, a young, sharp, charismatic volleyball coach who seemed to live and breathe victory. She spoke with a quiet confidence that drew people in. She had a way of making every athlete feel seen, every effort feel meaningful. Under her leadership, the Ridgefield Ravens went from obscurity to national prominence. To the public, she was a pioneer, a woman leading a powerhouse team in a sport long overshadowed by men's programs. But behind the banners and the speeches, behind the perfect record and the media smiles, there was a darkness that crept into every practice, every locker room, every life she touched. Her players called it the circle. It started as a trust exercise, a ritual she introduced after a rough season. At first, it seemed harmless. After each game, the team would gather in the locker room, form a circle, and share one fear, one secret, one weakness. "We can't win unless we're raw," she said. Truth is power. The girls believed her. They spoke of insecurities, heartbreaks, family struggles. Melissa listened, encouraged them, and promised that what was said in the circle stayed in the circle. But it didn't. She began using what she learned as leverage. If a player underperformed, she'd remind her of that fear she once confessed. "You said you crumble under pressure, didn't you?" She'd whisper during practice. "Maybe that's why you missed the serve." It was subtle at first, manipulative, but not yet monstrous. Then she started isolating them, calling private counseling sessions after hours, telling them they needed to purge distractions to achieve greatness. When one player, sophomore captain Leah Adams, began dating someone outside the team, Melissa saw it as betrayal. She called Leah into her office and said, "You can't serve 2 masters. You're either mine or you're done." Leah thought it was just jealousy or stress talking, but soon she found herself benched, her position given to a freshman who followed every word the coach said. The message was clear. Loyalty to Melissa came before everything. Other players noticed the shift. They watched as their coach grew possessive, controlling, obsessive. She monitored their social media, forbade them from seeing friends outside the team, even dictated what they should wear to project discipline. Her commands were always cloaked in that same justification. "We're a family, and I protect what's mine." But it wasn't protection. It was possession. The turning point came when one of the girls, 19-year-old Casey Morgan, broke down after practice. She told her parents that Coach Drayton had been emotionally abusing them, manipulating, threatening, even sending late-night messages under the guise of mental toughness training. Her parents went to the administration, but Marissa was untouchable. The team was winning. Sponsors were flooding in. Her contract had been renewed with a massive raise. The university looked the other way, until Casey disappeared. She was last seen leaving the gym after a closed-door meeting with Drayton. Her car was found the next morning parked by the river, keys still inside, her phone locked on a half-typed message that read, "She won't let us," before cutting off. Search parties scoured the woods for days. Volunteers combed the banks, but Casey was never found. The investigation that followed exposed the full scope of Drayton's control. Dozens of former players came forward with eerily similar stories of psychological torment, of forced isolation, of being made to believe their worth only existed through her approval. One player described her as a cult leader with a clipboard. Another said, "She convinced us that the pain she gave us was love." When police seized her laptop, they found hundreds of journal entries written about her players, tracking their emotional states, weaknesses, fears. In one, she wrote, "If they trust me enough to break, I can rebuild them stronger, in my image." That line became the heart of the case. It wasn't coaching. It was control disguised as devotion. Under mounting pressure, the university suspended her, then quietly cut ties. Marissa was arrested 6 months later on charges of coercion, harassment, and obstruction of justice in connection with Casey's disappearance. She denied everything. "I gave those girls purpose," she told reporters as she was led away in handcuffs. "They just couldn't handle greatness." Years later, a hiker found fragments of human remains downstream from where Casey's car was discovered. DNA confirmed the worst. The prosecution reopened the case, and Drayton, now stoic and cold, refused to speak. During trial, former players filled the courtroom, watching the woman who had once been their hero, now stripped of the authority she'd abused. When the verdict came, guilty of manslaughter and abuse, she barely flinched. As she was escorted out, Leah Adams, now in her 20s, stood up and said softly, "You never taught us to win. You taught us to be afraid of losing you." The gym where the Ravens once trained is still there, though no one practices after dark. The championship banners remain, collecting dust. The circle is gone. In its place, on the locker room wall, someone painted 3 words in quiet defiance: "We speak now." And for the first time, those words meant freedom. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments.